So, like I said at the top of the podcast, kind of the reaction publicly to all of these issues, international, internal domestic problems, economic problems, political problems, these personal issues with the Romanov family, is a huge uptick in protests and strikes, where once again, this doesn't just happen overnight. It accelerates after the beginning of World War I, but there had been a pretty steady uptick really since before Tsar Nicholas II had even taken power. And just to give you kind of a statistical frame of reference here, so in 1860, or throughout that decade, Russia averaged about 6 worker strikes a year in the entire country. So 6 instances a year where workers would walk off the job to protest either conditions or government policies or whatever. By 1905, the year of that Russo-Japanese War, still another 12 years until the Russian revolutions, they're averaging 176 of these. Things are starting to really reach critical mass. Now, I mentioned also at the top of the podcast that, a misnomer that I think a lot of Americans have is that, well, the Russian Revolution is this one kind of, violent upsurge. They remove the Romanovs, they kill them, boom, it's over. And it doesn't go down like that. Instead, there's 2 separate revolutions that happen months apart for pretty much 2 totally different reasons. The first of these revolutions is oftentimes called the March Revolution because, aptly named, it happens in March. Another thing to kind of understand about the naming of these events is that, the Russian calendar is different from the calendar used here in the United States. So sometimes you'll hear different months, especially with the Second Revolution. Some sources will refer to it as the October Revolution. Some will refer to it as the November Revolution. You're going to get that variance depending on which kind of source you're looking at. But either way, this first revolution happens in March of 1917. And the first revolution is set off by, similar to the French Revolution of 1789, by a protest march led by women workers in St. Petersburg. That old adage that you don't want to mess with a group of kind of angry women and their friends, right? Okay, this is a good life lesson for you. This group marches on the Romanov Summer Palace in St. Petersburg to protest the war, to protest shortages, to protest the lack of leadership from Tsar Nicholas, to protest all of these issues. And this group of workers swells by about midday to somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 people. In fact, there's a lot of existing pictures of this that still exist that shows this big common area outside the palace and all the people starting to kind of mill about. Well, Nicholas gets word of this from his advisors. He's at the front. He kind of sends back messages. And his initial order is the same order that he had given on Bloody Sunday back in 1905. All right, call in the troops, clear them out, fire into the crowd, do whatever is necessary to put down this public show of discontent against the dynasty. Well, what was different about this time is that the soldiers that were called in, the St. Petersburg garrison, were primarily the people that weren't fit for active service on the Eastern Front. All your young, kind of professionally trained, active soldiers were fighting the Germans. The people garrisoning St. Petersburg were either old, veterans from maybe a previous war, maybe somebody who had suffered and been wounded in the Russo-Japanese conflict, or they were wounded veterans from World War I that were not fit to return back to active duty. Either way, both of these groups of people were generally people that had no love lost for the Tsar. And when they received this order that, hey, you're supposed to fire on this group of 200,000 closely packed together unarmed women, they just flat out refuse. They just stand down. So like many revolutions, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it's It's a revolution that starts with the military's unwillingness to carry out government orders. Well, Nicholas then gets word of this shortly after, and after some level of discussion, he returns back to St. Petersburg and then decides to abdicate. The plan that Nicholas had agreed to was that him and his son would both step down. Nicholas realized that, that Russia needed some level of leadership, that his sick son was not going to be able to fulfill that capacity. So he agrees to abdicate the throne, but only on the condition that the throne then passes to his brother Michael. Now, this in itself wasn't popular, with common people, and frankly was never carried out. His brother Michael had actually been living in Switzerland in exile for a number of years. He was somebody that prior to World War I had an affair and a child with a married woman. He was kind of the black sheep of the family. And so it was kind of like suggested that he just go away on a long vacation for a while. So that's who Nicholas wants to dig up to become the next czar. Something that's not going to go over well. The other thing that he agrees to is that he's going to step down. He's going to become a private citizen, but that he's going to be allowed to continue, to live in comfort and with his family, and that he's not going to be harmed or anything else. And that power then would be passed to a new government called the Provisional Government. Now, the Provisional Government, the best comparison I can make in terms of how it was supposed to work, is it was almost supposed to be like a constitutional convention. If you learn about the Constitutional Convention in American history, it was people from kind of all different backgrounds. Okay, it was meant to be this kind of broad representation of all the major political groups in Russia. So you maybe had, people that were avowed monarchists that supported that this autocratic absolutist government should still remain in place. You had people, that maybe favored kind of a Western style democracy modeled after Great Britain or the United States. You had people that were maybe moderate socialists, that wanted greater government control of the economy, more in the way of wealth distribution. You had people that were pretty radical socialists. And then you had super extremist groups like the Bolsheviks. People that wanted forceful redistribution in its totality along the lines of the Communist Manifesto. So all these groups were supposed to take part in this lovely convention to draw up a constitution, to create a new form of government. And at the same time that they're supposed to do this monumental task, they're also supposed to figure out an end to World War I. Quite a lot on the table for a group of people that don't like each other and don't really have anything in common. So once again, when we kind of circle back and we talk about these Russian revolutions, the first of the revolutions is supposed to fix the problems. Supposed to address all these things that people had issues with. It results in the abdication of a Romanov czar. It does not bring about communism to Russia. That's only much later. While this is all going down, the Germans fighting against the Russians kind of smell blood in the water. It had been at least part of German strategy from the beginning that they understood, kind of thinking back to my analogy at the beginning of the podcast, they understood that Russia was this dying tree, or that the Romanov regime was this dying tree. It became a concerted part of German strategy that what can we do to help this tree fall? Can we dig up the roots? Can we, push on the trunk a little bit? Can we make a few incisions down by the base here? What can we do to help it topple? And what they ultimately do is they get in contact with the leader of this Bolshevik group. the most radical of kind of the radical mainstream politicians, Mr. Vladimir Lenin, probably a name you've heard of before. Lenin had been living in exile in Switzerland. In fact, he was actually living on the second story of an apartment right next to a sausage factory. So he was living in pretty humble conditions, not, lap of luxury, doing some level of writings, doing some, at least attempts at political organization from abroad. Well, the Germans go dig this guy up. And they say to him, hey, how about we transport you back home? The czar's been toppled. This new provisional government's in place. And so they take him and they put him in a freight car. And part of the story behind this is that supposedly they locked the freight car so that Lenin couldn't get out because they were afraid that he would spread his, extremist socialist ideas in the territories that he was going through. One of my favorite podcast guys, Dan Carlin, described it as an intellectual contagion, that they were afraid that this idea would get out and infect all of Europe. So they take him, they ship him all the way up to the front lines, they put him on a ship on the Baltic, and they sail him into St. Petersburg. And he arrives in St. Petersburg to, adoring crowds that greet him, kind of a celebrity figure. And he shows up with this great catchphrase that he promises the people, if they support the Bolsheviks, that they will deliver peace, land, and bread. Bam! We're gonna give you the answer to all your problems. Gonna get us out of the war. We're gonna fix the food shortages and the inflation. We're gonna do something about redistribution of wealth. This absolutely resonates. The other thing that Lenin does pretty much from the get-go, which is brilliant and pays dividends in the second revolution, is that he starts to politically organize and eventually arm smaller groups called the Soviets. Of course, we recognize that name from the eventual name of the country, the Soviet Union, 1922. Soviets were worker councils. So if you worked in a factory, you were then a member in a Soviet. So maybe you'd have like these meetings after work every once in a while or after your shift where you could, at least the idea was that you would kind of vent or you would say at the meeting anything that was wrong with, the country or with your job or with your conditions or whatever. And the idea behind the Soviets then is that the Soviets would convey that to the provisional government and that members of the provisional government would hope to rectify it. It was meant to be a form of kind of representation. Well, Lenin and the Bolsheviks started to go into these Soviets and win people over to their side, get some of the top dogs in the Soviets to become card-carrying members of the Bolshevik Party, go and give all these lovely speeches, and then they start handing out weapons at some point and organizing militarily and making plans. If you wonder, well, why would so many of these Soviets support this? Well, it's because from pretty much April to October, the provisional government just waffles and does nothing. The war continues to go badly. I mean, whole military units on the Eastern Front by this point have just stopped fighting. People going AWOL, troops mutinying. I remember reading some primary source documents before by German soldiers remarking about the Russians firing on their own trenches. I mean, the Russian army was falling apart. So things were getting even worse. There was no peace agreement in sight. This constitution wasn't happening. These groups were just bickering back and forth. And the only people that seemed like they had some level of a tangible plan was this most extreme group, the Bolsheviks. On November 7th, then, really without warning, armed factory workers all over the country, not just in St. Petersburg, not just in Moscow, but all over the place, launch a concerted attack to overthrow the provisional government. They attack government offices, they occupy legal offices, they arrest members of the provisional government. It's a swift and very decisive coup. This is then the second revolution, what's ultimately referred to as either the October or the November Revolution. It's this revolution that brings the Bolsheviks to power. When they gain power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks immediately start to negotiate for peace with Germany. They pay a massive cost in terms of giving up land. But once again, they realized that their control was extremely tenuous. That even though they had overthrown the government, that there were still all these other groups, all these other political groups. You had the Mensheviks, for example, which were a much more moderate socialist group that had actively vowed to fight them. So they had to follow through on these promises to keep what public support they had in this coup. We then see almost immediately civil war break out in Russia. And the civil war takes kind of two main sides, okay, even though it's not really a true two-sided civil war. On one side, you had the Red Army. The Red Army was the Bolsheviks, them and their supporters. And they were fighting against another group that generally called themselves the White Army. And these two sides are going to fight, this ongoing civil war for a period of about 3.5 years. The White Army, even though it was made up of pretty much anybody that wasn't a Bolshevik, was not really a true united fighting force. I mean, once again, you think about it, it's like, okay, if you got one group of people that are fighting that, want to bring back the monarchy, and they're fighting in the same White Army with people that are moderate socialists, and they're fighting next to people that want to create a parliament along the lines of Britain, those people have nothing in common in terms of end aims. And so their actions oftentimes weren't coordinated. They didn't communicate well. It made easy pickings long term for the Red Army to kind of isolate and defeat them one at a time. As a side fact, actually, while this civil war breaks out, some of the other Western European nations, the United States, Great Britain, actually sends military contingents of their own to Russia to try to bail out the White Army. But very quickly, they realize that it's a hopeless, lost cause, and they pull out their troops. There's actually American troops stationed way up north at a place called Archangel during this war. Extremely bloody war, very destructive war. So it's like you have the end of World War I, then you get this civil war that immediately breaks out. And on top of that, you get the Spanish flu, this worldwide pandemic that comes in. And that's one of the untold stories of this whole chaotic, few years, is that, there's no real one government that's able to game plan how the nation is going to deal with this terrible disease that's killing millions of people. Well, all this chaos of the Civil War and the overthrow of the dynasty and the overthrow of the provisional government transpires, so too in this setting do we see the ultimate assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children. As I mentioned, whenever Tsar Nicholas had first abdicated, he had just stepped down and became a private citizen. He had lived from March through November just in St. Petersburg or his country estates the same way that he had always lived, pretty much in opulence. When the November Revolution happens, though, he was then placed in a state of house arrest. And in that state of house arrest, he was then exiled more into the interior, into Siberia, because it was the fear of the Bolsheviks, the people in power in that area, that the White Army would get Nicholas and they would use him as this rallying point, and he would become this leader in the Civil War against him. That people would kind of fall in line and unify against, the Red Army with him kind of leading the way. So there's a lot of scholarly debate out there on, was the plan from the get-go to assassinate him, or not. Either way, they place him under house arrest and they whisk him far away from where much of the action was. Far away from the capital city, far away, heck, even from Moscow. So first they send him to this place called Tobolsk. I probably am butchering that name. And then they send him to a place called Ekaterinburg, which is in the foothills of the Ural Mountains, roughly about 850 miles to the east of Moscow. So he lives there, stays there from basically April through July of 1918, specifically at a place called the Ipatiev House, probably butchering that as well. In July of 1918, what heralds his ultimate killing is that a White Army contingent makes a major offensive toward Ekaterinburg. Seems like, they're right down the road, a few miles away, and the guards and the leadership in the area realize we got to get Nicholas, we got to get him out of here. We got to do something with him. White Army's too close. So on the night of July 16th, the family is woken up abruptly in the middle of the night, and they're woken up by the guy who becomes the chief executioner, a man by the name of Yurovsky. And they're told that, hey, you got 30 minutes to dress, pack up your stuff, get downstairs. We're leaving. They pack up all their stuff. They get their clothes on. They go down into the basement where they were told to meet. And the family was then told to kind of get in a line, get all close, because they were going to take their picture to prove to the Russian people that the royal family was still alive and that they were unharmed. And when they get all nice and close, the soldiers then raise their weapons and open fire. Some of the reports from the executioners is that supposedly when they fired these guns, the bullets actually would hit the girls specifically and shoot off in all directions and ricochet all over the place. And that it almost seemed like the girls were like protected by this force field. Well, what it was that they had sewn in all of their jewels into their dresses, thinking that they were leaving and that they wanted to have that resource in case they needed it down the road. They didn't want the guards to know that they had all this jewelry with them. The bodies were then taken, disposed in an old abandoned mine shaft, covered up with lime, and then the Red Army moves out of Ekaterinburg. After this killing, rumor existed in the Soviet Union for decades that not all the kids had been killed. That yes, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, had been killed, Alexei had been killed, but that two of the girls were missing. That some of them maybe had survived. And this whole story had additional life breathed into it. There's actually a whole bunch of people that pop up in various places, specifically claiming to be one of these Romanov family members. Hey, I'm the heir to the throne. This was big headline grabbing stuff in the 1920s, 1930s. Probably the single most famous example of this is in the 1920s. There was a woman who was pulled from a river, I forget if it was in Germany or Poland, who when she was pulled out claimed to be Anastasia Romanov, the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas. And age-wise, it worked. She was roughly the age, and when people looked at her, they looked at pictures of Anastasia, from 1917, 1918. They're okay. There's some level of a resemblance here. But what was really weird was that this lady that claimed to be Anastasia seemed to know the answers to a lot of, really detailed questions about court life or about the Romanov family themselves, stuff that a common person prior to the advent of the internet and Google would not know. And that she spoke fluent Russian. Because these clues all seem to actually lend some credence to her claims, they even bring her before some of these extended family members of the Romanovs, and some of these other Romanov family members actually believe that, yes, this is Anastasia. Well, eventually, quote unquote, Anastasia moves to the United States. She marries, I think, like a Virginia professor or something, lives her life there, claiming that she's Anastasia to the day that she dies. Well, eventually they're going to do DNA tests on her, and they find out that she's not Anastasia. Instead, it turns out that she was a escaped Polish factory worker by the name of Anna Anderson, or that's what she called herself, who had escaped and gone missing in like 1920, and then had shown up in this river a few years later. Now, that said, when the Soviet Union collapses, it was acknowledged that, hey, yes, we in the Soviet Union had exhumed a bunch of these bodies in 1991 from, this mine shaft near the Ipatiev house, but that two were missing. Now, the part that didn't jive with the rumors is that one of the bodies that was missing was the body of Alexei, the son. The other was one of the girls. So then, of course, that gets everybody up in arms and, a whole bunch more conspiracy theories. Well, finally, in 2007, researchers find those last two bodies nearby, basically burned in a nearby field. And if any one of you ever has a chance to go to St. Petersburg, Russia, if you visit, the Peter and Paul Cathedral, which is the burial place of the Russian czars, you can actually go in, and they have a separate alcove set aside where Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, all 5 children, as well as some of their servants that were killed, are all buried. So, that whole mystery has been kind of laid to rest, but only, really in the past 10 years or so. So that kind of wraps up the full story of this whole chaotic time period and everything that went into it. I think it's important for you to understand that establishment of the Soviet Union, though, isn't like an instantaneous thing. Okay, it takes time. That name Soviet Union, USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, doesn't start to be formally used until 1922. So the Civil War is going to go on until 1920. I've seen estimates as high as 15 million deaths in Russia. And once again, it's kind of a high water estimate that died during the Civil War. It's a gradual process. So when we pick up kind of in our next unit, we'll build from this. We'll talk a little bit about ultimately what the architect of the Soviet Union, Mr. Vladimir Lenin, sets up in terms of a government structure, what his idea of this perfect communist state was going to look like. And then we'll talk about how Joseph Stalin goes about usurping that.